This is Sam Hall, and this is the RBC Louisville podcast. I'm joined again by my friend and pastor, Pastor Jim. Pastor Jim, you doing all right today?
I'm doing very well. It's actually my anniversary today, Sam. So
wow,
35 years of marriage. So
that's incredible. I think we need like we have party
confetti
streamers
or something
come
like
down.
that would be good.
That is so great.
So if I look especially happy today.
Yes. So well, we want to dampen that happiness a little bit here and talk a little bit. We talked in our last episode about the confession and kind of what it was and why churches might use it or might not use it, different confessions. But we also want to talk, that's more informational.
Yeah.
I think we want to talk a little bit more about some of the polarizing elements of the confession. In particular, the 1689 confession, which is the one this church holds. So what is the dark side of the 1689 confession?
Is there a dark side?
Is there a dark side?
So if you were here for our discussion, we made numerous Star Wars references, which we'll drop for this episode. But Sam, it's an interesting, I want to tell a story here about something. When I was in college, so this was back in the 1980s, the mid-1980s, I had a professor that some listeners may have read some of his books. There was a man named Richard Belcher, Dick Belcher. And Richard wrote some books about the doctrines of grace, and there were novels. They called them theological novels, and the first one was called A Journey in Grace. And it was about a young guy who became a pastor, and he was asked if he was a Calvinist, and he originally said no, but then he said no because he didn't know what it was, and so he searches it out, and eventually he becomes a Calvinist. Well, Dr. Belcher and I would get lunch together regularly, and he told me when he was working on this book, he said, I'm writing a book that I want to call How to Be a Calvinist Without Being a Jerk. And so whatever it was, whatever the connection was between the doctrines of grace and getting on to confessionalism and sometimes being a jerk about it, sadly goes back. This is not a new phenomenon. So I think back often to that discussion. So the sad reality, Sam, that is that there are different ways to hold to the confession, just as there's ways to hold to our Constitution and in certain ways. I think there are ways that are, and the term I like to use is robust, that some people like to use is a cheerful, joyful confessionalism, and I'm going to explain why that should be the case. But sometimes there are those, and we live in the day and age of Twitter, so this is the year 2024, if somebody's documenting this 1,000 years from now.
Digging this up
in space somewhere. But they're gonna look back, and this is the days of X or Twitter, and where there's a lot of combativeness associated with those who hold to the 1689, a lot of interwarfare. Our history as churches, sadly, is that there's been a lot of division. There's been a lot of polarization, not just with believers outside the confession, but actually by those who hold to it, and you don't hold to it the way that I do, and if you don't hold to it the way that I do, then what does that say about you? And at times, among some, we have a reputation as being combative. Now, the Word of God encourages us that there are doctrines that we need to fight for, and there are errors that we need to confront, and we need to confront sharply. There are errors that divide and that ultimately damn. And one of the texts that we've used in the life of our church throughout the years is found in the early verses of Jude. Jude is just one chapter. But Jude begins by saying, as he's writing, he said, I was desirous to write concerning our common salvation, but I felt compelled to urge you, and he's writing to the church, not just to pastors, to contend for the faith that was once for all delivered to the saints, because certain men have crept in unaware, and he goes on to describe that they deny the lordship of Christ, they have a message that turns grace into licentiousness, etc. And so this language of contending for the faith is sadly interpreted by some as being contentious about the faith. And there is a way to talk about these things in a way, again, that it's always us against them. And why I believe the confession of faith actually teaches against that. There's a couple of reasons. And one of them I touched on last time, and that is our document is rooted in the Westminster Confession, Presbyterian. We're not Presbyterians. A Congregationalist document. We're not Congregationalists. We're Baptists. But when the framers of our confession wrote their confession, again, written in 1677, not published till 1689 because of when what's called the Act of Toleration was passed, these men were saying, we agree. If you put the Westminster, the Savoy, and the London Baptist together, I'm not sure of what the exact percentage is, but it's 90+% agreement. They were saying, look, we believe what you believe. And one of the things I enjoy and really appreciate about our confession, the more I've studied it, is there was a genuine, what we call Catholicity. That's not Roman Catholicity, but a Catholicity of saying we're part of a broader movement, and we believe that these are our brothers and sisters in Christ. And there was also, for these Baptists, a humility. I mentioned in our previous podcast that the London Baptists, there was a first London Confession. Sometimes the 1689 is called the Second London Confession. There was a first London Confession, and some men signed both documents written over 30 years apart. But what they did, having written that, they then read the Westminster, which came out a couple of years later, and then the Savoy, which came out about 13 years after that. And they said, it's better than what we wrote. That they did a better job expounding on these things than we did. So there was a Catholicity, there was a humility, but there was also a righteous tenacity that said, we believe they did get some of these wrong. Now, the tenacity, I think, that showed in that is they could show full appreciation for a sense of the genius of the previous documents, for all those things in which there is happy agreement, but they also said, we're still not convinced on these matters, particularly of baptism, and what you've written is not convincing. But one of the things I appreciate about that is that it wasn't a knee-jerk reaction. It wasn't, like, well, I'm gonna post something right away. These guys are idiots. They spent 30 years or more meditating on what had been written, and could have allowed themselves to be convinced. But this is a situation where they said, no, we believe that the Scriptures teach these things, and so that's why I said that I think the confession itself rejects the kind of arrogance, or to use my friend's old language, being a jerk. Confessionalism shouldn't make you a jerk. So that's one of the reasons, is because it's written in a context of Catholicity and of humility. But the other thing is that so much of what people appreciate about this document and what draws them to it, as opposed to more generic confessions of faith, is that it is Reformed. And if you boil down what Reformed theology is, it's a theology with a big God, a sovereign God. It's a theology that exalts the glory of God and that humbles the pride of man. And that we would use the doctrines of grace to then become arrogant and judgmental. And the Bible reminds us, Titus 3 is one of these great passages that speaks to this, that we should speak evil of no man, remembering that we ourselves were once lost and blind and hateful and lustful, and it was the grace of God that found us. And Paul wrote to the Corinthians and said at one point, he says, what do you have that you have not received? And then, if it's all of grace, then we didn't do anything to earn it. I'm not smarter than anybody. If we understand these things, and these things are right and true, it's because God has revealed them and shown it to us. And right now, in His providence, He's withheld it from somebody else. Oh, not to make you proud, ought to make you humble. Right. That's what these doctrines should do. All of our salvation should humble us and make us gracious and loving toward, especially toward other believers, but also hopeful toward unbelievers, no matter how dark their condition is, because we believe a powerful God, the God revealed in the Bible and spoken of so powerfully in our confession, can open people's eyes and bring them to life. So I think, again, a robust and cheerful confessionalism understands the background of the confession and what the confession teaches, should not make us hard to live with.
Right.
It should make us, I hope in many ways, easy to love and cheerful and hopeful, even while we stand firm that this is what we believe is the truth of God. You can do that without being a jerk,
Right.
I hope.
Right. You would hope.
I don't know that I always did. I don't think I always did that well. I think I had some of that pride in the past, and God has dealt and is dealing with me on that. So.
Well, so to summarize then, it sounds like the context in which the document was written, the hearts of the men that were writing it,
Yes.
as well as the fact that it's prescribing around the gospel,
Yes.
which should produce humility,
Yes.
love within us all.
Yeah.
That should be something that creates not divisiveness or divisiveness, but
Right. Yeah, right.
bringing people together.
Exactly. And it doesn't mean you can't have doctrinal clarity.
No.
And it doesn't mean that you cannot say, honestly, look, we disagree with this brother or with this church, and here's why. Some of these issues you recognize are more important than others, to say, these are the hills we die on. These are the places where we can have some disagreement and still count each other as brothers. But it does give a defense. So this is why we believe what we believe, and this is an articulation of what we believe, and we hold to that, and we welcome others to come and study and to see that, and that what a church believes and what it confesses, I believe, are some of the things that really ought to go most fully into the kind of church you choose to be a part of and have your family be a part of. That doctrine does matter. What you believe does shape your life. It shapes not just your theology and your mind, but your words and your actions and your interactions and your relationships. And to be able to go to a place where you have as much agreement as possible, sometimes, again, without being arrogant, some people have talked about they go to a church and I don't know where that guy's coming from. I don't understand what he meant by that. And when you can say, well, listen, it comes in the context of a confession or a doctrinal statement that is known and believed and held to, it gives, as many people have talked about in the past, it gives some safeguards and guardrails that wherever you go, it's going to be within these parameters that are clearly laid out and clearly available for anybody to see.
So then how do you feel like we as confessional believers guard ourselves from becoming pretentious?
We have to recognize that how we speak to others and about others does reveal something of our own hearts. Out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. And if we can have a heart that regards that those outside of our stream, if they hold to the gospel and they love Christ, that they're our brothers and that we are ultimately members of each other. And one of the things that's helped me, Sam, years ago, I phrased it, I think, in this way, if I can remember the way I said it to the church years ago. The vast majority of those that Christ loves, is saving, and using to build his kingdom are not confessional Reformed Baptists. Right. We're a relatively small tribe. And while we can, so at the one and the same time, we recognize and believe that this is really rich, this is really good. I'm really thankful I have found this. It has brought me joy. It's helped to stabilize my Christian life. I believe it is good for a church, but to recognize that we're in a real minority of those that the Lord loves, has saved, and is using to build his church. So I think if we can keep that in mind, it will allow us to be able to be both tenacious in what we believe. As one man said, we can be narrow in our convictions, but we should be broad in our affections. and look for, as Barnabas did. When Barnabas went to the church in Antioch, it said he saw the grace of God and was glad. That's not all he saw, no doubt. I'm sure he saw sin. I'm sure he saw inconsistency because there were people in that church. But he looked for the grace of God. He found the grace of God, and he was glad. And we ought to be glad whenever we see the grace of God in whatever community of Christians, whether they hold to everything we believe or not.
And I think just to add to that too, like you were talking about how we're a minority, I think whether we're a minority or a majority,
Yeah.
like that should not be what determines how proud we are of
No,
what we
no,
believe, right? It should be what we believe. It's the grace of God that
There's never
has
an
saved us
excuse for
from
pride. Right?
Exactly.
So,
Exactly. It doesn't matter our status. There should be no status
exactly.
within sinful people who have no reason
Right.
to ever have the grace of God
Exactly.
upon them.